Okay, looks like we're live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of Primate Conversations. My name is Rene Bobe, and it's a real pleasure to welcome today Jason Kamilar. Jason is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He holds a doctorate, a PhD from Stony Brook University, and is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Evolutionary Anthropology. Jason has a very long history of publications on a whole range of topics relating to primates, from aspects of primate evolution to primate ecology. And I'm sure he could have given us today talks on many of these different topics that range across different aspects of primatology. But we will be hearing about the research that he's co-directing in Kasanka National Park on the Kinda baboons. And thank you for joining us, Jason. I'd like to ask those of you listening to us on YouTube that if you have questions that you would like to ask Jason, you can write them down in the chat function, and we will try to get to those questions at the end of the talk. So welcome, Jason, and we're all yours.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Renee, and thanks for inviting me to talk about the Kinda baboons. Very exciting research project that we have going on. So my talk is going to be divided into three main sections and kind of organized by the past, present, and future. And so the past is, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about Kinda baboon behavior, especially about mating seasonality, male-female relationships. The second part will focus on a paper that's currently in review that's looking at maternal social relationships and fitness. And then I'm going to finish up with a couple of new projects that are starting next month and in January, so right on the horizon. And I should also say that everything that I'll be discussing today is the result of lots of collaborations with many people who I'll also mention along the way. And the first of these people is my graduate student, Anna Weyer, and really, before I start talking about the data, I should probably backtrack a little bit and talk about the origin of the project and the study site. And most of the behavioral and ecological data that I'll be talking about today was collected by Anna. And she founded the site more than 10 years ago and has really been the driving force behind this project. There's been some recent reorganization of the project leadership, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But she's been the really driving force for the last 10 plus years. And Kasanka is the only field site where we have habituated Kinda baboons, and it's due to Anna's perseverance. I also wanted to mention this recent article we had published in UMass's magazine, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. And so if you follow that link, or I posted it on Twitter last week, you get a really nice summary and some cool photos of the baboons at Kasanka. Okay, so to orient everyone where Kasanka is located, here's a satellite map. And I highlighted the park in red. Let me get my laser pointer right around here. And this part of Africa is really interesting because it's very much a transition between the Congo rainforest and the drier savannas and deserts of Eastern and Southern Africa. Here's another map, and what's highlighted here is the central Zambesian Miombo woodland ecoregion. So that's shaded in purple, and it covers quite a lot of Central and Southern Africa. And these Miombo woodlands are a large region of tropical grasslands, savannas, and shrublands. There's quite a lot of diversity in terms of plants and animals. The part of this region where Kasanka is also has quite a lot of evergreen trees, which makes it interesting, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And just for other interest, this little part of of this region, which is just north of Kasanka, that's not shaded. This is mostly flooded grassland ecoregion. Now, Kasanka is probably best known for the migration of about 5 to 10 million straw-colored fruit bats that roost in about a 50 to 60 hectare patch of forest, evergreen forest at the field site from October to December every year. So they're there right now. It draws lots of tourists, and this migration of fruit bats probably has lots of interesting biological implications for the resident animals that live there. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end of my talk. Of course, there's lots of other cool mammals there. Here are some photos and some camera trap photos from a recent doctoral student at UMass who's in the evolutionary biology program, Kadambari Devarjan. And she focused on the carnivores at Kasanka, lots of striped jackal and civets and genets, kind of small to medium-sized carnivorans. But then you have large ungulates like the sable antelope too. So lots of cool mammals there. And I'm going to focus on the Kinda baboons today, right? So here are the Kinda baboons. Here's their estimated range in Africa. And Kinda baboons are really interesting. They've been long regarded as a subspecies of yellow baboons, although recent genetic and morphological evidence, and I would argue behavioral evidence, suggests that they're a separate species. And so I think most folks agree now that they're a different species. Of course, they form hybrid zones, which is not with the parapatric taxa that are around them, the yellow and the chacma, which are not too surprising. So that's sort of a common baboon trait as well. And what we know about Kinda baboons, they seem to be pretty distinctive compared to other savanna baboon species. So they have lots of interesting traits. The most obvious one is their body size. And so they're the smallest baboon in terms of body mass, and they have the least amount of body mass dimorphism. The males have the relatively largest testes size relative to body mass. Many infants are born with white natal coats. About half are born with white natal coats, which is unusual for a baboon. And we're discovering lots of interesting behavioral characteristics that distinguish them from other savanna baboons. They have relatively low levels of aggression. When males immigrate into the group, we do not see group takeovers. We see that males and females associate throughout the year, and there's more seasonal breeding compared to other baboon populations. And so these traits I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So when we consider baboon traits, when we think about traits that distinguish baboons from other primates, we often think about these traits in the context of sexual selection. And baboons generally conform to a pattern where reproductive asynchrony creates female monopolizability, right? So males contest over dominance rank and gain priority of access to female reproduction. And this creates a dynamic of strong male-male direct competition. Females express a variety of sexual signals, most famously the exaggerated sexual swellings that you can see here. There are behavioral signals, copulation calls that advertise fertility relatively accurately. And these signals, these female signals, are hypothesized to enable females to select for high quality males indirectly by instigating male-male competition. Now, even though we have a good amount of information about this for many baboon populations, we really don't know lots of details for how Kinda baboons fit into this picture. And so this is a table from a paper we published a couple of years ago with Megan Petersdorf as the lead author, and Anna as a co-first author. You can look at some of these traits in some more detail. I'm not sure how well you can see that. I think you can probably see it pretty well. Let's see. So one of the interesting things that we're finding out about Kinda baboons is that relative to other baboon populations, they have more female reproductive synchrony, or is low for other baboon populations, but relatively high in Kinda baboons. In addition, female sexual swellings are typically large or medium in most baboon populations. We're not finding that in Kinda baboons. They tend to be relatively small. You could see some of that here. And when we start looking at, when we start comparing the sexes of each species, not surprisingly, there's prominent body mass and canine dimorphism in most baboon populations. Yet when we look at Kinda, they exhibit the least amount of dimorphism in terms of body mass, and especially canine size. If you look at canine size, it's a little bit less than 2 to 1, male to female. And the next lowest one we have is our yellow baboons, which is 2.75 to 1. So it's quite a lot lower, the canine size dimorphism in Kinda baboons. And then finally, if we look at males, again, the relative testis size is the largest of any baboon. So there seems to be something, something going on with the Kinda baboons that are quite different compared to other savanna baboons. If we look at the degree of reproductive synchrony in more detail, here's a figure showing average rainfall per month, this line right here, and then the number of births per month. This is across a 7-year period. And we can see that rainfall is seasonal, not surprising. It peaks in the winter, pronounced dry season in the summer. And then births are also quite seasonal, showing an inverse relationship with most births occurring from April through September, declining until there are no births in January through March. And during this period of time where we collected these data, group size averaged about 80 individuals total. If we look at birth seasonality and female sexual swellings, we see that most mating occurs from October to March. And if you look at the top part of this figure, we can see that there are multiple females in estrus at the same time. And so what that does is it makes it difficult for the alpha male of the group to monopolize the mating opportunities during much of the mating season. One interesting characteristic of the Kinda baboons that I've not talked too much about yet are the social relationships between the females and males. And so here's a figure from our paper illustrating the proportion of time each sex spends grooming the other during intersexual grooming interactions across different types of baboons. And so if you look at this graph right here, you can see that females spend more time grooming males than vice versa in most baboon species. When you look at the Kinda baboons, they basically have the opposite pattern. And so males groom females more often. And in fact, the adult male Kinda baboons are initiating the grooming. They're the ones that are maintaining close proximity to the adult female Kinda baboons across female reproductive states. And during these male-female interactions, males groom females a significant proportion of the time. And so as a consequence, the amount of time that's spent, social time that's spent are related to males and females devoting to each other in terms of social interaction, as opposed to females and other females. And so I'm going to talk about that in a bit in terms of social network, some preliminary analyses of Kinda baboon social networks. So here's just a short video I'm going to show. It does have some audio, but the audio is not super important. Let's see if this works.
Simon and Madonna have finally found some time together away from the truth. She's accepted his advances and allows him to groom her. It's strong confirmation of their continuing relationship.
Adult males and females are having these very strong bonds lasting over several years. Males are
So that was just an example of some of these interactions between males and females. That was Anna towards the end there, saying that males are the ones actually initiating these interactions. So a couple of years ago, we started working on some social network analyses of the group. We presented this at the AAPA meeting. We're working on a full manuscript right now, but one of the things you can see from this preliminary result is that these female-male relationships are really prominent in the social network itself. And so the blue circles are adult males, the female circles are adult females. And in many cases, you can see the strongest bonds and these are based on grooming data, are between males and females. And if you look at the location of the males in the social network, they tend to be in the interior of the social network as opposed to the periphery of the social network. And so this is pretty interesting and pretty different from what we know of other types of baboons. And so we can compare this to some of the baboons at Amboseli. And so that on the right, we have a social network published by Jenny Tung and colleagues in 2016. And you can see from the Amboseli group that the strongest bonds tend to be between females, and the males are the individuals that tend to be on the periphery of the social network. So something quite different from the Kinda baboons. One of the other interesting things about the behavior, especially of the males and the Kinda baboons, is that the dominance data that we have show that males in our study group exhibited bottom entry upon immigration. So no males entered the group in a high-ranking position. All males entered the group as the lowest ranked male. And that's on this part of the table right here. And so there's relatively little physical aggression among males when these immigrations occur. And we have no documented cases of male perpetrated infanticide or any cases of suspecting male perpetrated infanticide. The other interesting thing is during this particular time period from 2011 to 2018, two of the males that immigrated into the group have remained in the group for quite a while, for 4 years. One of them achieved the alpha male position in 2015, was still alpha in 2018. And so they have relatively long alpha male tenure periods, averaging about 2 years, although it could be longer. So all of these Kinda baboon traits leads us to think that they may have evolved under weaker direct and stronger indirect male-male competition compared to other baboons that are better known, like Chacma and yellow baboons. And so there may also be stronger mechanisms of direct female choice. And so much of this story was the focus in terms of sexual selection and behavior was the focus of Megan Petersdorf's recently completed dissertation. So she's working on publishing these papers right now. So be on the lookout for Megan's publications in the coming months and years. Okay, so that was sort of like the past section. Now let's move on to the present state of the project. And so I mentioned a couple of times that Anna founded the site more than 10 years ago, and she's really been the primary force behind the research and as well as the community outreach that's been going on during this time. In early 2020, Anna wanted to transform the project and grow it by reaching out to colleagues that have complementary research interests and strengths. And so now, or at least in early 2020, we expanded the directorship of the project to broaden the scope of the research, the community engagement, and also to fully integrate one of the Zambian universities, Copperbelt University, into project management. And so we currently have 6 co-directors of the project: Anna, Megan, Benjamin, myself, Kenny Chu, and India Schneider-Kreis, who are all engaged in the research and the production of new data and running the field site. And so Anna's going to the field just in a couple of days. She's leaving on Thursday. Kenny is also leaving soon, I believe. And Megan's going there in January. Benjamin, I think, is going to stop by the park in the next couple of months as well. So, so we're excited for this. So, we're really hopeful that this is going to really jumpstart some really cool research. I also need to mention the field team that we currently have. So Marley, Boston, and Selena, they obviously play a really critical role in data collection and the inner workings of the site. And this has been especially true the last 18 plus months when none of the directors have been able to get to Zambia. And so COVID has really played an important role in limiting what we've been able to do these past almost 2 years. Okay, so this next section, I'm going to talk about a paper we have in review that focuses on social relationships, female reproductive success, and infant development. So we know that females with stronger social bonds, and there are different ways to measure that, but females with stronger social bonds tend to have higher infant survival. We know this in yellow baboons and chocolate baboons. We also know that females with greater social network connectedness have higher infant survival in chocolate baboons. And so there seems to be a fitness benefit from being a social female and from having a higher rank. Other studies have looked at the social bonds between females and males and have also found certain benefits for females, such as lower harassment of the mother and offspring from other group members, and potential infanticide prevention by unrelated males. In olive, chocolate, and yellow baboons, these female-male associations generally begin during gestation, they last through lactation, and they tend to be positively associated with the likelihood that the male primary associate is the sire of the offspring. And these relationships are considered to be related to parenting effort rather than mating effort, and they also have been observed to terminate at the death of the offspring. So we were interested in looking at some of these patterns in kinda baboons. And so we wanted to test the hypothesis that social relationships of the female shape female reproductive success. We predicted that stronger female-male relationships will be associated with increased infant survival, shorter interbirth interval, and more rapid infant behavioral maturation. And we were interested in also comparing these effects to those of stronger female-female relationships and of female dominance rank. So we have data collected across several years representing over 1,500 hours of behavioral data. We have a couple of different analyses going on, and they include slightly different data sets. The survival analysis that we have included 82 infants from 29 mothers. We have infant behavioral analyses, which included 21 infants from 14 mothers. We calculated adult female social rank using Elo scores based on female-female displacements. And we defined adult female social phenotypes in a couple of different ways. One was using the individual sociality index, and this was based on tabulating all affiliative interactions with adult group members on a dyadic basis and dividing the sum by the combined sampling effort per dyad. We then summed these dyadic scores for each female and with all other females, so like a within sex measure, and between males, so between sex measure. And we also calculated another metric looking at female relationships with her top female or male partner. And this was defined as the top partner individual sociality index, or TSI. And this was based on dyadic affiliative interactions as well, but calculated per dyad instead of summing across all individuals like we did with the ISI. We also quantified infant development based on their position and proximity to the mom. And so we had a few different an ordinal scale, ventral clinging, so the infant is clinging to the mom's belly or chest, dorsal clinging, then 0 to 2 meters from the mom, 2 to 6 meters from the mother, greater than 6 meters, and then out of view, considering out of view is going to be relatively far from the mom. We also had interbirth interval data. A couple of analyses. The first one for survival, we used Cox proportional hazard models with random effects to look at the relationship between maternal dominance, which was Elo score, or sociality, those two indices, and infant survival to 2 years, as well as interbirth interval. And then we also modeled the frequency of independent behaviors, so the behavioral development of the infant as a function of maternal social traits using a logistic regression and a GLMM. Okay, so what did we find? We found some interesting results. So the first one was looked at infant survival, and we didn't find that there was much of an effect of Elo score or any of these social indices that we used on infant survival. And actually, if you look at this graph, this is the highest ranking female has a darker line. So if anything, it's sort of a little bit reversed of what we would expect, but really there are no significant differences among these or significant effect of ELO score on infant survival. One of the things that we should mention is that based on our data, the infant mortality rate is actually quite low. So we calculated it at 17% mortality. And in other baboon populations, it tends to be about double that. So we don't know exactly if that influenced some of these results. The next thing we looked at was interbirth interval. And this figure is showing maternal Elo score. And it was associated with interbirth intervals. So higher ranking females tended to have interbirth intervals. The p-value was right around just below 0.05. When we corrected for multiple tests using a Bonferroni correction, that result became not statistically significant. So it doesn't actually change the effect, but it changes the p-value enough that we didn't consider it statistically significant. And here we have a figure illustrating infant development, behavioral development by age. And so here we have density plots of each behavior against the age of the infant. And so dependent behaviors like riding on the mom's ventral surface or dorsal surface, they were most common when the infant was about 6 months old or younger, or more independent behaviors like the infant going at least 6 meters away from the mom. They were concentrated more at about 1 year of age. And so this is not too surprising. As the infants get older, they become more independent. So really the question now is this rate of maturation, is this connected to the mom's social rank or sociability? And here's a figure we have where we plotted the predicted values of the proportion of infant independence on the y-axis against infant age on the x-axis. And the different colored lines represent different ELO scores of the mom. And so red is the average ELO score, purple is 1 standard deviation above average, and green is 1 standard deviation below average. And so overall, we found a significant positive effect of the interaction between infant age and maternal Elo score. So as infants of higher ranking moms displayed higher frequencies of independent behaviors more frequently, and this was especially the case in female infants. And so this is just illustrating these sex differences in the infants themselves. And so here we have something that is similar using not the Elo scores, but these other social metrics. And so I realize there's kind of a lot going on here, but the highlights of this these series of results is that infants of mothers with higher individual sociality index values with females only were significantly more likely to reach independent behaviors at a younger age compared to moms with lower values. And this was particularly strong with infant females. Now, maternal individual sociality index with the males was not significantly associated with differences in the infant maturation overall, but female infants of mothers with higher TSI male values were significantly more likely to reach higher proportions of independence at a younger age. What else? And so when we controlled for some of the information, so it's somewhat challenging representing some of these models in figures because there are lots of variables, including lots of covariates. And so sometimes it's really apparent that there's an effect, other times not so much. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that infants of mothers with higher top partner, female and male scores were significantly more likely to be independent faster than moms with lower values. And this was particularly the case for female infants. And when we ran some more complicated analyses using more covariates, some of these effects, or this one particular effect, sort of went away. But the one that was more stabilized was this male relationship. So the mom's relationship with the top partner was a male, that influenced infant development. And so it seems like there's importance of female-female relationships for infant development, as well as female-male relationships influencing development. Okay, so what does this all mean? So we are suggesting that dominance rank and affiliative relationships shape reproductive success in these female kinder baboons in different ways. There are fitness benefits for females that are associated with being high-ranking and having strong affiliative bonds with other females, as well as having strong affiliative bonds with top male partners. And so we did find that these benefits principally take the form of faster infant maturation, as opposed to infant survival or interbirth interval, with the latter being statistically significant until we use these Bonferroni corrections. One of the things, again, to think about in terms of the effect of maternal social phenotype on infant survival is the mortality rate of our study group, which is about 17%. And when we compared this to other baboon populations, so Chacma baboons in the Okavango Delta, mortality was around infant mortality was around 38%. Yellow baboons at Amboseli was around 33%, and olive baboons about 47%. They seem to be much higher. So, so that's an interesting distinction. So one question is, why do we have relatively low infant mortality at Kasanka? It may be related to low rates of agonism and aggression, low or absent infanticide. It may also be related to predation abundance, which is relatively low at Kasanka compared to other places. Okay, so that paper's in review, and we're kind of interesting to see what kind of comments we get back from the reviewers. So I'm going to switch a little bit from social behavior to ecology. And I mentioned that Kasanka is in this interesting part of Africa, where we have interesting transition zone between the rainforests of Central Africa and some of the drier regions in the south and east. And so we have a few projects focused on this in particular. So here's just some more details about the different types of habitats. So we have this Mayombo woodland, which is the majority of Kasanka National Park. It's about 70% of the park. But we also have these Mushitu forests, which are the evergreen forests. And that's where the bats roost in the winter, like right now. Baboons also use this forest because the trees are producing fruit. That's a relatively small part of the park. It's about 0.1% of the total area. So it's only about 60 hectares. And we also have seasonally wet grasslands. So grasslands are about 16% of the park. And the baboons use all these areas. Here's a habitat map in the upper left. This little purple triangle is the project's research station. These darker green is the evergreen forest. This sort of yellow is the grassland. We have the woodlands over here. Here are some daily path lengths from the baboons. These bluish purple lines, and you can see they're using all these different types of habitats. The pink circles are sleeping sites. And then we have a 95% kernel density plot down below. So one question we had is related to the baboons' movement ecology. So baboons have been known to employ different strategies to find resources, including strategies that can be modeled via a Brownian motion model or a levee walk model, which is often connected to ideas about using spatial memory, knowing where resources are in space and time. And we know that Chacma baboons use spatial memory to locate preferred food patches, but when these preferred patches, preferred resources are not there or not present, they tend to find food via a Brownian walk model. And we also know that research on yellow baboons indicates that they travel in a goal-directed manner, again, inferring spatial memory or related to spatial memory during predictable and high resource or high quality foods, but also use random walk models when foods are really abundant. Now, lots of these other studies are typically located in field sites which are more homogeneous than Kasanka. And so we're interested in looking at this question of Kasanka because the habitat complexity is relatively high. One of the other things we're really interested in is not only how the Kinda baboons locate food, but how they locate water resources. And water should be important for most baboon populations because they live in relatively dry environments, whether it's seasonally dry or dry most of the year. One of the things we're also interested in are the sort of consequences for eating or drinking different types of food or water for the gut microbiome of the baboons. So gut microbiome diversity and studies of primate gut microbiomes have really taken off the last 10 years or so. So maybe somewhat surprisingly, we still have very little information about the effects of drinking water on the gut microbiome of primates and baboons in particular. And it's an interesting question because fresh water has been argued to be one of the richest natural habitats of bacteria. So naturally occurring water sources vary quite a lot in their characteristics, such as pH and salinity, which influence microbiome diversity. In addition, watering holes act to facilitate, or probably act to facilitate, horizontal transmission of bacteria between mammal species because many of the mammals use the same water sources. And so it's important to understand how primates, especially primates living in dry environments, locate and use water sources, especially in the context of climate change, where the distribution and availability of these water sources is surely going to change. So this work is the focus of one of my doctoral students, Amanda Fuchs' dissertation work, and she's going to investigate how the Kinda baboons find food and water at Kasanka, how these resources influence gut microbiomes, and the role of water quality. So do these baboons choose higher quality water sources? And if they do, does that have less of an impact on their gut microbiome? Again, are they choosing cleaner water? And so we have a few different ways of measuring that. And then how does that influence gut microbiome diversity? And so we already have some pilot data that we presented at the AAP meeting last year. And I'm not going to really go into too much of the detail here, but we collected samples from anthill soils and ran some microbiome analyses. The baboons, which are pretty much showing kind of the typical microbial phyla that you would expect for a primate, but of course they vary across individuals and at different time points. And then for various sources of water in the park. And one of the things we want to demonstrate is that there is important variation in the microbial composition of different water sources at the park, and that's what we see. We see that with the alpha diversity measurements, as well as the specific composition of the microbial composition of the samples. And these blue samples are the water samples, and we see quite a lot of variation. So it'll be interesting to see what Mandy finds. She's leaving for the field in January, so she's almost a year behind schedule because of COVID, but I know she's excited to get started. Okay, so that's one of these future projects. The other future project, which I'm really excited about, is looking at bats, right? These straw-colored fruit bats. And so I had to include this image because it's just a really, really cool picture of the straw-colored fruit bat and its anatomy. You could see really its wings, basically. You can see all the blood vessels and bones and things. And so we're interested in looking at the potential transmission of microbes and gut parasites between the bats, these migratory fruit bats, and the resident baboons at Kasanka. And I'm going to show a short video just to get the feel of what this area of Kasanka National Park looks like and sounds like during the bat season.
Find a roosting place. Kasanka's migrant straw-colored bats are starting to stir. The baboons and the bats share the same taste in fruit. These winged mammals will travel up to 65 kilometers, feeding on the ripest waterberries and the Synchrony. And consume half their body weight in fruit before returning to the Mashutu forest at dawn.
So these bats are roosting. So we have about 5 to 10 million fruit bats that are roosting in a patch of forest that's about 50 hectares. And these fruit bats migrate all over sub-Saharan Africa. So they're coming to Kasanka from South Sudan, from Cameroon, from South Africa, from all over sub-Saharan Africa to Kasanka for a 3-month period to feed on fruit and to use Kasanka sort of as a home base to fly around 50 kilometers from Kasanka to feed, and then they come back to roost there. So it's really, it's the largest known mammal migration. There's lots of cool stuff that we're starting to learn about these fruit bats. And so when we're thinking about microbial and parasite transmission among animals, we have some data on within species, social interactions promoting transmission, and primates are most primates are highly social mammals, and this enables the transmission of microbes and parasites among individuals in a social group. And so we know that chimpanzees that have a higher number of social partners also tend to have greater microbiome diversity. There's some studies looking at captive rhesus macaques and individuals with more direct and indirect social connections were most associated with E. coli transmission, which I'm illustrating here. And so individuals within a social group tend to have more similar E. coli based on the genetic structure of the E. coli compared to individuals across groups. And then there's been studies at Amboseli looking at individuals with intense grooming relationships. They tend to exhibit more similar gut microbiomes compared to other individuals in the group. So we have some baseline data for the social transmission of microbes and parasites within groups. And of course, we also have some data for across groups. And we know that microbes and parasites are commonly transmitted between animal species, and that plays a critical role in animal health and biology, right? This sort of topic is especially relevant now with COVID and some of these other diseases, which are likely zoonotic in origin. And so these transmissions among species may occur or often occur among animals that regularly interact or regularly share resources at a particular location, but they may also occur through migrating species that interact with resident animals for only part of the year. And so these seasonal influxes of particular species may have important effects on the microbe diversity and the parasite diversity of resident animals. And we really know very little about the relevance of migratory species on the biology of resident animals. And so, UMass in the past year gave us some funding to collect some pilot data to look at this at Kasanka. So does habitat overlap between the baboons and straw-colored fruit bats facilitate the transfer of gut microbiomes and parasites between these two species? And we're also interested in looking at the innate or inter-individual variation in the baboon's innate immune system and seeing if that has an impact on these transmissions as well. And so, again, this is a project that we would have liked to start last year, but we couldn't. So we're excited that we are collecting some pilot data next month. And for the baboon data collection, or I'm sorry, for the bat data collection, this is going to be spearheaded by my doctoral student, Katie Katrinos. And we've partnered with Tigomara, who helped us facilitate a collaboration with scientists from Max Planck, Dina, who runs the project, and Edward, her postdoc. And they have been trapping and placing GPS collars on these fruit bats for several years. And they're the folks that have all these great data on looking at the migratory pattern of these fruit bats across sub-Saharan Africa. So while the bats are being collared, by Dina and Edward and other folks. Katie will be collecting biological samples from the bats. Okay, just to sort of end with a couple of other important parts of the project. So, so our project will continue some great work started by Anna in 2010 with community engagement. And so Anna started organizing a science, math, and conservation club for girls in the villages near the park. And we are aiming to continue that into the future. 4 of these young women actually have gone on to work for the park, which is great. And we're also aiming to develop new mechanisms for educating local children, especially into the high school years. So high school is not mandatory in Zambia. And so Anna has already provided scholarships in the past for 5 young women to attend private high school. And we want to continue and facilitate and build the infrastructure to increase that number. The other thing that's really important with our project going forward is establishing a resource for Zambian undergraduate and graduate students. So at present, research centers that provide students with hands-on ecological training are relatively rare in Zambia. So we're currently building a formal connection with Copperbelt University that will provide some pathways for students to gain hands-on field experience. And we have some specific goals of hiring graduates of Copperbelt's master's program in wildlife ecology as field site manager of the project and some research staff. So we're really excited about this relationship and building increasingly strong collaborations and connections with the students and faculty in Zambia and through Copperbelt, and opening up some training and academic opportunities for everyone involved. So I'd just like to thank all of the other co-directors on the project, Anna, Kenny, Megan, Benjamin, India, Catherine Leggett, and other staff members at Kasanka who are critical in making our project work. The Department of National Parks and Wildlife Zambia, everyone in my lab, of course, Renee for the invitation, and these organizations for funding the work. And thanks very much for listening to me today.
Thank you, Jason. Very, very good talk. Very interesting. I mentioned to you that some of the pictures that you've shown remind me a lot of Gorongosa and our project in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, which is also part of the Miombo vegetation in that whole part of Africa. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that that the site is sort of in the transition from the Congolese Central African forests and the somewhat more arid regions of Eastern and Southern Africa. And I wanted to ask you, do you have any elements in the fauna or the flora that show any influence from the Central African forest, or is it very much a more along the lines of the what we see in Eastern Africa?
I mean, at least in terms of the primate community, it's definitely more similar to like the Eastern Africa. So we have at Kasanka, there are Kinda baboons, blue monkey or some form of blue monkey, vervet monkeys, and some galagos, which are pretty reminiscent of some of those East African forests. And so in the primate composition for sure, the other mammals, I guess it's sort of a mix. Like some of the carnivorans, you see some of these genets and civets in the Congo, and those are really thought of as I think of them as generalist species ecologically, maybe even more so than baboons. And I'd have to think a little bit more in terms of other species that are found in the rainforest that are also found at Kasanka. Yeah. There's probably some really cool sort of historical biogeography work to be done if you in that region, if you can collect some samples from some of the mammals, maybe some of the carnivorans and some of the ungulates, and look at maybe historical patterns of dispersal and speciation in that area. It's probably a big undertaking, but you'd probably get some really cool results.
Yeah, in fact, along those lines, also it looks to me like Xanthus in that part of Zambia would be right along this biogeographic area, what Jonathan Kingdon calls this arid corridor, so to speak, that links Eastern Africa to Southern Africa. But it looks like the region where you're working there will be very much along this line that would be a biogeographic connection between, again, fauna, mammals is what we tend to focus on, but fauna in general that would occur more towards the northern parts of Eastern Africa, connecting with the fauna that we see in Southern Africa. Do you see any patterns there that, in terms of the biogeography, again, not so much the Congo rainforest, but linking these environments towards the north in Eastern Africa and towards the south in Southern Africa?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind are the, I guess, the Kinda baboons themselves, and their, some of the recent molecular studies that have been done and looking at baboon phylogenies, and this evidence that, these chacmas and the yellow and all these other baboon taxa seem to be feeding into the genetic history of the Kinda baboons, and which is sort of interesting to think about, that they, at least taxonomically, were often thought of as a subspecies of the yellow baboon. But if you look at the genetics, they're not really as closely related to the yellow compared to some of the other baboon taxa. So yeah, there are probably some really interesting questions to ask in terms of those questions, that topic. Yeah.
And another question, Jason, the park itself, how disturbed is it in terms of anthropogenic influence? How much do you have, or how much are you missing in terms of predators, or some of the larger mammals?
Yeah, that's a great question, for sure. Definitely some of the larger predators are absent because of anthropogenic impacts. And so that's definitely the case. There is still illegal hunting going on in the area, in the part of the park where we work, because there's a constant presence. It's lower than some other areas, but it's still present in the park in general. So in terms of, I think the biggest impact that we know about are the sort of removal of the large carnivores. And so, right, and are the baboons behaving the same way they did 50 or 100 years ago when those carnivores may have been there? Is this a recent sort of behavioral change? I don't know. But yeah, it's, there are very few places on the planet where anthropogenic impacts are not playing an important role. And so this is no exception here. Yeah.
And along those lines, do you think that the Kinda baboons that you're looking at are fairly typical of the species in general? Or are there other studies that you can compare with? Or is the park in some ways relatively unique ecologically? And
yeah, it's hard to know, because really the Kasanka is the only place where we have decent behavioral data. Kenny Chu looked at hybridization of chacma and Kinda in a park that's more in southern part of Zambia, closer to Lusaka. But he didn't really have much in the way of behavioral data, as far as I know. So yeah, that's sort of, I guess, a big question is, if we look at other places where Kinda baboons live, how similar is their behavioral traits? Or what we're seeing at Kasanka sort of the typical behavior and ecology of a Kinda baboon, or is it something pretty different? Mandy Fuchs published a paper a few years ago looking at the ecological niche models of different baboons, and one of the things we found is that the Kinda baboons tend to be pretty different, at least in terms of the climatic diversity of their geographic range. And so if, you sort of subscribe to a close connection between the local environment and the behavior and morphology of a species, then that may lend some evidence that the Kinda baboons are sort of or at least a partial product of this more unique environmental context that they live in. But obviously we need more data to be sure of that.
Yeah, very interesting. You also described the environment as very much of a complex environment, heterogeneous, a mosaic, and two questions related to that. Is there a role for fire in maintaining the heterogeneity of the park? And I wanted to ask a bit more. You described some forests within the park, and I wanted to ask a bit more of what these look like. What kinds of forests are they, and how they fit within the overall context of the park?
Yeah. So fire plays almost certainly plays an important role. One thing what the park does is they do have intentional fires to clear out brush, and what's the role? I'm not exactly sure in terms of the vegetation. And in terms of the forest, the ones that I think about most are sort of the bat forest, because of some of the things we're working on now, and that's a really small part of the overall park. So the total park size is something around 35,000 hectares, and this bat forest is less than 100. So it's a very small part. You have what's much more common are the woodlands, these miamba woodlands, and these more deciduous forests, or woodlands are probably a better description. But they, have relatively open canopies, and so it's certainly not nothing like a rainforest or a continuous forest. And so, one of the interesting things about Kasanka and these Kinda baboons is, and the habitat itself, is thinking about using baboons as models of human evolution, right? And sort of this older idea of humans walking out into just a savanna landscape, a homogeneous savanna, and now probably thinking, well, it probably wasn't quite just a savanna, it was probably more complex. And maybe these Kinda baboons at Kasanka, maybe they make a better model for early hominins and their ecology than some earlier studies. So when we write grants, that's one of the things we talk about to make the connection with human evolution and biological anthropology, is that it's sort of interesting to think about the behavior and morphology of these Kinda baboons, which in some respects are more human-like, right? Smaller body size, less sexual dimorphism, less canine size dimorphism, and the habitats that they're living in. So I don't know how it all connects necessarily, but it makes for an interesting story anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking as you were talking about describing the Kinda baboons, about some of these various hypotheses. Lovejoy's comes to mind, but others go over some of these anatomical characteristics and behavioral characteristics that, in some way, the Kinda baboons do seem to have quite strongly. But yeah. So anyway, if you wanted to say anything about that, anything else, that would be great. I have another question here from one of our listeners. Do you think that the baboons adapt their habitat use at all due to the bat migrations?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that our study group, their home range, the bat forest is within their home range. And there's another troop of baboon troop that is sort of adjacent to ours. I don't think we really know if those baboons use the bat forest very much. And of course, there are other baboon troops in the park that are further from the bat forest, and it's not like all the baboons in the park are migrating towards the bat forest during the season. So it may just be that our baboon troop is lucky enough to have that resource because it is fruiting at that time and they have the food. And so one of the things, if we get sort of a bigger grant to fund, is to look at other baboons in the park during the bat season, right? And you would expect that they're not changing at least their microbiome or other aspects of the biology because they're several kilometers from the bat forest, where our study troop is sort of right in the midst of it. But we don't know. If you're if you have 5 to 10 million fruit bats flying around the area for several months, that could be impacting all kinds of animals in that general area, and people as well. So there are plenty of villages that are basically in the flight paths of these bats. So.
Very good. Another question, Jason, if I may. We have here, thank you for a really interesting talk. Loved hearing about how kindas differ from other piper species. What types of parasites will you be looking at? Would these be macroparasites?
Yeah, the gut parasites are sort of the, it's kind of standard things you would look at. And so I don't think we have a whole lot of information about parasite transmission between bats and primates in general, not that I know of. And so there could be gut parasites, macroparasites, and then in terms of the microbial organisms, right now we're sort of focused on just looking at 16S variations. So basically identifying the particular taxa. Again, if we get more funding, what would be really cool too is to look at the functional aspects of the microbes, like what are the microbes actually doing, and which ones are more likely to transfer between species. And that's sort of a big open question.
Yeah, in fact, that's very much along along the lines of the next question that we have. I think it's you might have just touched on that, but the question says, thank you for a great talk. Do you have any thoughts on host diversity of any parasites, perhaps bats and baboons, and implications for testing any dilution effect in the region and impact on local humans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know Katie is really interested in for a dissertation. I mean, so she's going to start working on this project, and she's also interested in getting some samples from people that are in the park, right? And like I said, there are tourists that come to watch the bats. And so in theory, you could think about collecting fecal samples from folks that just arrive in the park, and then after they're there for 2 weeks. I mean, it's a little hard to tease apart. Gut microbiomes are so sensitive to what you're putting in your body. I think the trick will be to tease apart the effect of eating different food, right, versus a bat interaction or interactions among different people. And so that's one sort of challenge we have to think about. But yeah, the hosts themselves are really different, right? So at least in terms of host population, you have millions of fruit bats and you have less than 100 baboons. There's been a little bit of work on the genetic structure of the fruit bats themselves. And from what I remember, there doesn't seem to be much genetic structure. Like it's all just like admixed of one large population. So even though you have these millions of individuals, it's really hard to detect any specific like lineages within that group, which is sort of interesting to think about because, I mean, you wouldn't expect that with that number of individuals in a particular social group, whether it's a bat or a primate. And so there's also a lot to learn about the bats themselves, and so some like Dina and her lab looking at migration. There are lots of other things. India is interested in some of the other microorganisms that the bats may be harboring. So one of the things that's exciting about it is there's just so much to learn, and we don't know very much. And so it's sort of trying to think about what are the most interesting questions to tackle first.
Yeah, spectacular photo that you showed there of the bat in light.
Yeah.
Another question here, Jason. Any ideas of what selection pressures may have led to the difference in female-male relationships we see in kinda versus other types of baboons?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, one thing that I touched on before is that the habitat seems to be different. There's still seasonality, but maybe it's not as dry as some other places where baboons have been studied. Maybe there is a bit more fruit available or other foods that are available that may be especially appealing to the baboons. So sort of the question is why why are multiple females coming to estrus at the same time? Is it related to some ecological pressure that is sort of driving that that pattern? And so, something to think about is looking. I mean, I guess we can do some comparative sort of analyses, looking at possible selective forces in different baboon populations, and maybe things like reproductive synchrony. And there's been some work on that, but we can sort of add the kinda data point and see how they fit in.
And you mentioned, Jason, about how in grant proposals and so on, you introduced some of these ideas about models of human evolution using the kinder baboons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to ask if you can elaborate that a little bit. The clip that you showed, some of the video, talked about Zambia's peaceful primates.
Right.
And somehow bonobos also came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering whether there are any parallels with some other primates. And if you could just elaborate on how you think that studying the kinder baboons, baboons in general, but more specifically the kinder baboons, can help us understand some aspects of our evolutionary history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of baboon model for human evolution is an interesting one, and it makes sense. And it made sense decades ago when some of these models were first being thought about. Yeah, and the kinder baboon example, I guess if you compare the kinder to other baboons, maybe you do draw a connection between their habitat diversity, and some of their morphological and behavioral characteristics, which again are sort of maybe you could draw a parallel with early hominins, and you have a range of diversity and morphology, presuming behavior. Assuming behavior is connected to morphology in terms of sexual selection, body size dimorphism, and this sort of the human lineage, which the current endpoint of humans being a species with not a whole lot of body size dimorphism compared to other apes, I guess. And I guess, you could also think about it in terms of behavioral evolution, which is always a bit tricky, especially with modern humans, because the culture sort of impacts or covers everything. And there are certainly different ideas about the origins of human behavior and whether humans are innately aggressive or peaceful or some combination of both, and using chimpanzees as models for human behavioral evolution and not using bonobos, which is often the case. But if you use both species, then you get a very different picture of the origin of our behavior. And so, yeah, maybe the kinder baboon is sort of another piece of that puzzle, right? Drawing the contrast between bonobos and common chimpanzees and kinder baboons and yellow baboons or olive baboons, that you can have these relatively, one of the more interesting things also is that when we're talking about baboons is that, these species are they're closely related, right? And there's still some, you have these hybrid zones and presumably some gene flow, and yet you get some really different characteristics. You get different traits with morphology and behavior and ecology. And so it makes an interesting system, baboons in general, to look at whether it's adaptation or phenotypic plasticity or some of these other mechanisms of change. But you could see a lot of change in a short period of time, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, and considering the baboons more general, are the West African baboons also not rather atypical?
Mm-hmm.
Are they atypical in ways that are parallel with the kinder baboons or altogether different?
Yeah, in some ways, from what I know, they seem to be maybe intermediate. I don't know, and maybe that's too much of a stretch. But one of the things that sort of became interesting to me with the kinder baboons was looking at the that social network analysis, and the fact that you have males associating with a few females, not to the exclusion of other individuals, but forming these little clusters, social clusters within the troop. And so it's not a hierarchy like a gelato baboon, gelato monkey or hamadryas baboon. But maybe it's something a little bit more structured than a yellow baboon, or a different type of structure. And maybe the Guinea baboon is also something along those lines. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting because, a lot of the Guinea baboon data, it seems like it's relatively new or recently published. And so in some respect, it'll be interesting to see what that story is about in conjunction with the Kinda baboon story. And maybe you have some sort of convergence on either ends of this geographic spectrum with the West African baboons and the Kinda baboons.
But yeah, it does give you a sense of the tremendous flexibility for the genus, for Papio overall. The different species, ranging from hamadryas to Kinda and everything in between. Just tremendous variability in behavior and habitat, and in some ways, yeah, I think in our lab here we would tend to agree with you that they do make great models for understanding our evolution, and I think we share your interest in these baboons. But,
Yeah.
I think we have one more question here, Jason, if I may. Let me see. The self-domestication hypothesis has been used to characterize the behavioral differences between bonobo and chimpanzee. Do you think the hypothesis could apply to kindas as well?
I guess it's possible. I mean, I don't like to discount any possibility. Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't think we've thought about it in that particular like self-domestication context. But yeah, the fact that the aggression levels are really low compared to other baboons, it opens up an interesting question as to why and how. And hopefully with more data, we can begin to address that. Yeah, if you certainly look at whether it's rates of agonism or other kind of social characteristics on a baboon phylogeny, it's quite diverse, right? And so what leads to that diversity? That's usually the ultimate question that folks are interested in, and it's hard to answer. But hopefully we'll start answering it in the next several years.
Well, we definitely look forward to seeing how the project develops, and I think that's all the questions we have for now. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I love seeing the landscapes and your description of the baboons and all the great research that you have going on there. So thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. Great. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And for next week, we will have Kat Almeida Warren talking to us about the evolution of technology. And I hope that you can join us again next week, same time, same place. And again, thank you so much, Jason. We really appreciate you taking the time to give us a wonderful talk and answer all of these questions.
Thank you.